So next gen is finally here, but we're still at the very beginning of it all, with the Xbox Series lacking exclusive next gen experiences at launch, and the PlayStation 5 only having a few titles that won't also run on the PlayStation 4. At this very early stage, one of the most next gen feeling titles to me happens to be the PlayStation 5's pack-in game Astro's Playroom, and that all really comes down to it being an excellent tech demo for the PS5's impressive DualSense controller. And real quick, if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you can stay up to date on everything happening with the channel. With all that out of the way, let's get down to it. I was somehow lucky enough to secure a PS5 pre-order from Best Buy when they first went live. It was an absolute mess and it involved a ton of refreshing, but I've now had a week to get familiar with the PS5 and its new controller. And I know there are a ton of people out there who weren't able to secure one for the holidays who might be curious to know what the new controller's haptic feedback feels like. So I thought I'd do my best to describe the experience. Now, I know we stick with mostly Nintendo content on the channel, but I thought it would be fun to compare the DualSense's advanced haptic feedback with the HD rumble of the Nintendo Switch Joy-Con, because while there are some differences, they actually have a lot in common. In fact, the tech behind the HD rumble of the Switch Joy-Con and the DualSense's advanced haptic feedback is made by the same company, Immersion. Nintendo worked with Immersion for the first time with the development of the Joy-Con's HD rumble, and it was a bit of a mystery at first, but over the years we've learned more about what makes the Joy-Con's HD rumble feel different. Traditional rumble relies on weighted motors to spin at varying levels of intensity to give you different sensations of force feedback, but it really ends up feeling like either soft or heavy rumble that feels about the same other than the intensity. HD rumble utilizes something called a linear resistant actuator that does a much better job of mimicking the sound something makes when interacting with it in-game. We've actually heard from developers who have implemented HD rumble in their games on the Switch, saying it's not all that difficult to work with. The Switch's SDK has a tool that essentially allows developers to take any sound file and convert it to a file that can be read by the Joy-Con's rumble motors. That's why if you turn your game sound down all the way and listen really closely to the Joy-Con while HD rumble is doing its thing, you can hear the sound the rumble is trying to mimic. It's a really neat trick, and it's surprisingly convincing when you feel it for yourself. Unfortunately, some of the most impressive implementations of HD rumble come from some of the Switch's earliest titles, and that's something I'm kind of worried about with the DualSense's haptic feedback. It's ultimately going to be up to developers to use the technology or not, and much like HD rumble, I could see the tech eventually becoming a bit of an afterthought. So when comparing the technology of the DualSense against the Joy-Con, I thought I'd go with what I think are the best examples on the respective platforms, and other than 1-2 Switch, the game that I think offers some of the best HD rumble is Golf Story. Okay, so I'm just doing a little messing around in Golf Story here, refamiliarizing myself with the controls a bit, and already I kind of forgot what good HD rumble implementation feels like in a Switch game. This game came out really early on in the Switch's life cycle, so it was just much more of a focus than it is now, and I really do miss it. You know, some games still implement it, and it's kind of a surprise when you figure out that they have, but nothing really has come close to the way Golf Story feels, at least to me. We did have 1-2 Switch, which was the Joy-Con's version of Astro's Playroom, you know, basically just a tech demo for the technology. But it was really gimmicky and kind of one-dimensional. There was a couple fun games. There was the one that had the marbles inside the Joy-Con, and you needed to guess how many were in each, and you could kind of tell the difference based on them, you know, bouncing around inside. And that was similar to the trailer we got for the Switch, where they showed ice cubes in a glass and being able to tell the difference between 2 or 3 cubes. So it was a fun little demo, but I haven't played that game since like the first week I owned the Switch. But I could see myself playing Astro's Playroom for quite a while, actually. There's an actual game there. So I'm just gonna knock a ball into the water here because I think that's one of the most satisfying examples here. Make sure these aren't wet after that just you can feel the splash, and it's so cool. It's you know, it's not as strong as the DualSense for sure, and I think Nintendo is probably concerned with battery life of the Joy-Con and the portable nature. So, you know, that's kind of one of the differences I noticed right off the bat. Golf Story is probably one of the strongest HD rumble examples I've felt, but other ones are definitely more subtle, and even with Golf Story, it doesn't feel quite as intense as the DualSense. But, you know, like I said, I'm sure there's a reason for that, probably a power saving one. So you can really just feel the difference in surface that, you know, the ball is hitting. And you know, landing a ball on like hard cement is going to feel a lot different than landing it on some rough grass or in the water again there, or in a sand trap. So yeah, I don't know that we really needed to do much in Golf Story here. I just wanted to get a feel for it again, you know, get the kind of best example of HD Rumble before I compare it against Astros, so I can just talk about the differences a little more clearly. So yeah, I think that's good enough for now, and let's jump into Astros. Okay, so let's jump into Astros. I'm gonna try and explain a few things that are happening on screen while I'm feeling them, so hopefully we can get that all in the shot here, but let's boot that up. So hopefully you're hearing all that, but as you can see that light kind of move across the logo there, I'm feeling that move through the entire controller. And you know, the O's there were just a different material. There were wood, so as Astro's running across, it's more springy on the letters, and then when he hits the wood there, there's just a different feeling, and it's really impressive. So yeah, coming off of Golf Story, just right off the bat, it's just a more powerful feeling. It feels like the motors inside are stronger, but it also kind of feels like, I don't know how to explain this, but it feels like there's more detail. Like the best analogy I can make for the difference between the Switch Joy-Con and the DualSense in terms of, you know, the feedback is kind of like the jump from 8-bit to 16-bit. I know some of you are probably way too young to even remember that change, but it's kind of like it's the same thing, but one version is just a lot more powerful, is capable of a lot more detail, and ultimately just ends up being more impressive. So, you know, hopefully if you're familiar with HD Rumble on the Joy-Con, that's kind of what you can expect from the DualSense, just something you've felt already, but just more impressive. Before we even talk about the adaptive triggers on the back here, there's one other element that isn't happening with the Joy-Con, and it's something similar to the Wii Remote actually, which had the little speaker on it and made all sorts of sounds as you were playing the game. And I really find it to be super effective with the DualSense, because not only are you getting the rumble based on the sound that the game is making to kind of mimic that, you know, feeling of the actual material, but you're also hearing it at the exact same time, so it just really drives home this sensory, you know, feedback. Like when Astro's putting on his little laser boots there, you're hearing them engage here, but you're also feeling it. And same thing when he steps across those metal O's there. You're hearing that sound come out of the speaker, and at the very same time, you're feeling that in the controller. So let's go into the actual game here. And you'll see here, I'm gonna use the touchpad to slide them up there, and I'll get that out of the way so you can see the game a little better. And even his steps, even as he's walking across these different surfaces here, you know, this feels different than walking on the glass. And yeah, you're hearing that pinging too. It's really interesting. So again, compared to the Joy-Con controller, the rumble just feels like it permeates this whole controller much more. Like it feels like this thing is just filled with those little rumble motors, is where it kind of feels like whatever's inside the Joy-Con is pretty tiny. And, you know, like I said, that's probably a battery saving measure on Nintendo's part to not drain the Joy-Con battery super fast with games that use HD Rumble. And I have noticed when playing PS4 games that don't really use the DualSense's haptic feedback, I think I'm noticing that the battery lasts longer than when I'm playing something like Astro's Playroom, which is just like using the advanced haptic feedback constantly. So I'm sure that had something to do with it. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet, which I think is one of the coolest features of the DualSense, is the adaptive triggers, which provide you with kind of varying resistance as you're performing different things in game. So let's see, I think there's a bow and arrow I can get over here. And Astro's Playroom just does this so well. Okay, so here's the bow. And I'm gonna use the trigger here to pull it back. So I'll get this out of the way so we can get the autofocus on. So it's just harder to push at the beginning here as you're trying to pull the string back. But then it just sort of gives. But as you hold it there, there's this slight tremble in the motor that kind of makes it feel like your arm is shaking as you're pulling back something. You know, you're using a lot of force to pull it back. So there's this little tremble as you hold it back, and then you can let it go, and there's this really satisfying spring. And you're also hearing that sound, but you know, I'm picking these guys off here. It's the weirdest thing. So you're also getting different rumble sensations as you're doing this, but then you're also just feeling that tension in the trigger itself. Oh, these dudes are mad at me. And this is something, of course, that, you know, we don't have on the Switch. We don't even have analog triggers. We just have the digital triggers. But the adaptive trigger thing is, I think it's the thing that sets the DualSense just over the top entirely. You know, the feedback is already really impressive, but the adaptive trigger thing just kind of feels like magic, honestly. And while I think Astro's Playroom does it really, really well, I don't think it's something that I'll always want to have turned on. You can go into the menu and disable the adaptive triggers. It's really interesting. I'm switching between, I have Spider-Man, the PS4 version, and I've been playing that on the PS5, and that doesn't use any of the DualSense's, you know, haptic feedback or anything. It's just standard. And going from that to playing Miles Morales, where you do have a bit of tension on the triggers when you're swinging through the city, with how often you're doing the swinging, I don't know if that's something that you'll always want there, because it ultimately just makes the button harder to press. Like, at first it was really impressive to have that sensory feedback as you're moving through the city, because you can almost feel the web stretching, and it's super cool. But after if you're playing for a couple hours or something, eventually you're like, man, it takes a lot more effort to press this button that I'm using all the time than when it does with something like the PS4, where it's just, you know, another button you're pressing. So Astro's does it perfectly, where it's never too resistive, if that makes sense. It's never like really, really strong. And you're not always using something that utilizes it, and it's just fun. But I think in some regular gaming experiences, or in something like Call of Duty, you know, where you're playing online and it's kind of performance based, and if someone's able to click the trigger faster because they don't have the adaptive triggers turned on, I could see it being a detriment in those cases. But yeah, as far as I understand, there's just little motors inside that are, you know, reading what's programmed into the game, and they have these little levers that come up and then resist against the back of the trigger here. It's just the L2 and the R2 that have that functionality, as far as I know. And they're kind of pressing against the the inside here. So you're really like, see, so right now there's nothing adaptive, and it's just a regular button press. But as soon as I pick up like the bow or that gun I was just shooting with, those levers pop up inside and press against this, giving you that resistance. So really, really impressive controller. If we didn't have this with the PS5, I can tell you I would be a lot less excited about it. I'd still think the games, you know, even Astrobot and Miles Morales, I'm probably grabbing Demon's Souls next, they look impressive. It's not the biggest leap in graphics that we've seen from generation to generation, but they still look really great. But the controller is really what makes this all feel like, whoa, this is new, this is something my PS4 can't do, you know? So this game, specifically Astro's Playroom, is perfect for showing a friend or showing family, like, hey, check this out, give this a feel, because it's so immediate. You can just walk around on different surfaces and they'll be able to feel the difference. So yeah, thanks for putting up with my rambling through all this. I hope that helped to explain things a little better. Nothing's gonna come close to feeling it for yourself, but hopefully that gave you an idea. And yeah, I think that's gonna do it. So there you go. I hope that helped a little bit to explain what the DualSense feels like. It's a really impressive controller, and I hope that developers take advantage of everything it's capable of. Booting up Astro's Playroom for the first time was an absolute marvel, and I hope that everyone out there who wasn't able to get a hold of a PS5 yet can find one soon so they can feel it for themselves. With so many similarities to the Joy-Con's HD Rumble, I also hope that Nintendo continues to iterate on the Joy-Con with the next version of the Switch, giving us something closer to the feedback of the DualSense. Some might view it is just a gimmick, but I really do find that it makes for a more immersive experience. And if you stuck around through all that and like what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing. And until the next video, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.